Compositional techniques. You have to be able to identify compositional techniques by ear. This would be in an audio track, or by sight in a given score. You also need to be able to define compositional techniques and write them to illustrate your understanding. We will be using this original phrase in these examples. Augmentation means that the note values are doubled. Therefore, you may need to change the time signature. In the first example, the note values have been doubled and the time signature changed to 4 minims in a bar instead of 4 crotchets in a bar. Therefore, you can maintain 2 bars. In the second example, the note values have also been doubled, but because the original time signature of 4/4 has been kept, you now have 4 bars. Make sure that you look very carefully at the question, whether you should be using the same number of bars or not, and whether you should change the time signature or not. In diminution, the note values are now half. Therefore, you may either have to use a new time signature, such as in example 1, where I've kept 2 bars, but the time signature now reflects what is in every bar. Or should you keep the same or the original time signature, you will now have to have fewer bars. So a 2-bar extract becomes 1 bar. Inversion means that every interval from one note to the next is now moving in the opposite direction. The type of interval or the distance is the same, but the direction has changed. So if my original goes a 6th down, a 4th up, and 1 step down, such as, my answer will go a 6th up, a 4th down, and a step up. So to look at the entire example, and the inversion, when you write an inversion, you may in fact start on any note. In this example, the answer starts on the same note as the original, except it is an octave lower. However, as long as you start on any note but follow the interval direction exactly, the answer would be correct. Retrograde. In retrograde, you start on the last note and end on the first. So, this becomes in retrograde. Repetition. In repetition, you can either repeat the whole phrase or a part thereof. In the first example, the whole 2-bar phrase is repeated, and in the second example, only the first bar. You could also use a fragment. So this is the first bar in repetition. Or a fragment from the second bar would sound like this. Please note that repetition must take place in the same voice or in the same instrument. Imitation. You now see a phrase or a fragment of a phrase being imitated by different voices or different instruments. This is different from repetition because although the fragment looks the same, it is moving between 2 or 3 or more different instruments. Sequence is when a phrase is repeated either higher than the original or lower than the original. Typically, you find 2 types of sequences, a real sequence or a tonal sequence. Real is when every interval is exactly the same as in the original. So, for instance, if I go a minor sixth down, then in my ascending sequence from my first note to my second note will also be a minor sixth down. A tonal sequence is when your sequence stays in the original key. So there's no modulation as part of the sequence. So here's the original again. And a sequence. You can hear that in the real sequence, every interval was identical to the original, and therefore I've actually changed key. Now the second example is a tonal sequence. You will notice that in a tonal sequence, the notes or the intervals are not exactly the same as in the original. You may have different steps or different intervals. However, the original key is retained. So here's the original. And here's the sequence, the tonal sequence. And you can hear that it stayed in the original key. The descending sequence, so instead of going up, is now going to start on a lower note. That was the real sequence, where every interval is identical to the original. However, it has changed to a new key. The tonal sequence, so this is the original. Has stayed in the original key. Ornamentation is simply when a phrase is decorated or embellished with ornamentation or runs to or twirls to fill in the intervals in between the notes.